Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third event in 5x15 series, 6 Ideas to Change the World, a new collaboration with Keystone Positive Change Investment Trust. Each month, we're hosting live conversations about some of the most pressing issues of our time, featuring some of the most compelling and hard-hitting work that's being published about the future, the 6 ideas that will shape life on our planet in the years to come. With extreme heat currently spreading across Europe and the globe, the question of climate migration, of how and where we live, is an urgent one. This evening's conversation really couldn't be more timely, and I'm very much looking forward to welcoming tonight's speakers. Gaia Vince's new book should be read not just by every politician, but by every person on the planet. These are words taken from a review in The Observer, and just one example of the extraordinary acclaim that Gaia's book, Nomad Century, How to Survive the Climate Upheaval, has received since its publication last summer. Gaia Vince is an honorary senior research fellow at UCL and also the author of several other books, including Adventures in the Anthropocene, which won the Royal Society Science Book of the Year prize, making Gaia the first woman ever to do so, and also the brilliant Transcendence. She's held senior editorial posts at Nature and New Scientist, and her writing has appeared widely in publications including The Guardian, The Times, and Scientific American. This evening, she's going to be in conversation with Henry Mance, the chief features writer at the Financial Times. Henry writes features for the FT Weekend and runs the Henry Mance Interview with Leading Figures, which appears every other Monday. He's a past winner of Interviewer of the Year at the Press Awards and also the author of the book How to Love Animals and Protect Our Planet. You can buy both of our speakers' books tonight from our brilliant independent bookseller, Newham Bookshop, and information about how to order them will be posted in the chat shortly. Remember too that we want to hear from you. Towards the end of this evening's conversation, there'll be time to address questions from the audience. So please do post these in the Q&A box at any time during the event, and Gaia and Henry will get to as many as they can. Without any further ado, please welcome Gaia Vince and Henry Mance.
Hi, good evening, and yeah, a real pleasure to be here. And I want to start by just echoing everything Jack said about Gaia's book, which is it is optimistic, wide-ranging, and amazingly concise. And I know that lots of climate books, lots of environmental books struggle with that combination, but somehow she pulled it off. And I read it on a very hot train in Italy, where the air conditioning had failed, and so sort of climate adaptation was at a real low point. And I imagine that same air conditioning is failing somewhere around Rome at the moment, and people are very hot and very sweaty and wishing that they were reading Gaia's book. And I think what's brilliant about it is that the right on the political debate, the right always talks about migration, or perhaps disproportionately talks about migration, and the left talks about climate change. And I think what Gaia's book, what Nomad Century does, is it shows that these are basically the same issue, and that a lot of the framing we have of it is wrong and unsustainable, is not going to be something we can hold on to for the rest of the century. So we've got an hour, and we're going to come to your questions, so please do send them in. But I want to start by asking Gaia, if I can, you dot in lots of lovely sort of anecdotes and perspectives and sort of evidence from trips, and I wondered, what are one or two of the trips for this book that really kind of shaped your view on migration?
Yeah, hello Henry, hello everybody watching. It's such a joy to be talking to you, Henry. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this. So in terms of the journeys, well, you know, this has been a book that sort of gestated over many years. So I first kind of became aware, I think, of the fact that people were migrating because of climate change more than 10 years ago, when I was traveling firstly through India, where people were they were having to move because of drought in some places, and other places because of river erosion, because of a change to precipitation, to rainfall and so on that was occurring there. And then as I moved around, it became something that was sort of growing in importance, particularly, I think, in Latin America. So along the Andes, where many rural communities have relied on glacier melt to irrigate their their fields, or to provide water for their alpaca farms and all of that. With the glaciers melting and disappearing and no rainfall, they were being forced to move to the cities and move to slum housing. And so that's kind of when I first became aware. And also, in the you know, the Indian Ocean and Pacific Island states that were already making plans to move their entire populations, because as sea level rise increased, they were getting these kind of compounding effects. So first of all, their land was disappearing because the seawater was eroding it away. And secondly, agriculture was becoming impossible because it was getting into the water table underneath. So even when you were kind of quite inland from the ocean, you still were feeling these huge effects of sea level rise. And that's actually something which is starting to affect a lot of communities in the United States and beginning to affect people in Europe as well. This kind of incursion into the water table of salt water is kind of polluting a lot of the water that people rely on, and that's an effect that I don't think people have switched on to. But anyway, what really prompted me to write this book was the fact that nobody's really talking about climate migration. No one's talking. You know, I've spent so long trying to get the issue of climate change sort of in front of people and get them to kind of notice that this is not just happening in the future, but kind of starting to already happen, and that we need to mitigate. We need to stop emitting so many greenhouse gases. And then there's this whole idea that we need to adapt as well, which is starting to creep into leadership discussions, but you know, we're a long way from doing anything about that, as you discovered on your Italian train. But no one's talking about the fact that large parts of the world, for large numbers of people, they will not be able to adapt. They're going to have to move. And so I was kind of, you know,
yeah, I think your book's already had an impact on that, because when I was hearing Nick Robinson talk about migration and interviewing a few people, I think last week on the Today program on Radio 4, he was coming back not just to the usual thing of these people are fleeing war and famine, but also they're fleeing climate change, and it's happening now. They're being displaced from there.
Oh, right. Well, so that's great. Like normalized. I mean, I can't take credit for that, but no, brilliant. I'm really glad that that is coming to the fore, because it's you know, it's been really obvious if you look at the climate models. But the problem is that the climate community and the migration community are very, very separated. So the climate community, you know, they're scientists that look at Earth systems and they model changes to atmospheric pressures and temperatures and chemistry and all of that. And the migration community are, you know, they're sociologists or they're disaster relief people, and they kind of look back at, you know, what's happened before. And then when they project to the future, they sort of just think iteratively it might be slightly worse because of climate change, but they don't get this idea that there's going to be a step change because of climate that's really going to impact it. And the two communities they're not really melding on this really important issue.
Well, let's look at what sort of underpins your book and what sort of, you know, frames it, which is the outlook. And you take a 4-degree rise as a kind of as a way to model it. And you know, I think that one of the reasons that some of our hopes about keeping temperature rise down might be a bit optimistic is we don't know about some of the feedback loops, some of the, you know, the effect of wildfires, of the melting of the permafrost, that kind of thing. So, you know, you take this 4-degree rise, and it's a pretty stark outlook. And I wonder whether you could talk people through about sort of which kind of countries or which regions you're talking about potentially becoming, you know, uninhabitable, or at least much less desirable to live in.
Yeah. So I looked at 4 degrees because if you look at where we're headed in the current trajectory, that's very reasonable in the because, you know, no one can predict the future apart from Mystic Med, and she's died. So we're now forced to look at models, and the algorithm basically they look at probabilities. So there's a kind of span of likelihood, a sort of grey space of likelihood, and then what some scientists do is just take the median of that and say that's where we'll be, and that's what's happened with the 2-degree target or the 1.5 degree target. But if you look at where we're going, 4 degrees is well within that trajectory. So it is perfect. We're right now, we're at about 1.35 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And, I think we've all seen the news, complete climate chaos everywhere. Mm-hmm. Including in Italy, where it's something heading up to 48 degrees, which is just mind-blowing, actually. So at 4 degrees, if you look at the models, if you look at what's predicted for the Earth systems, you find this kind of zone of basically uninhabitability because of multiple effects. And the effects that really hit humans and our livelihoods and our agriculture are what I call the 4 horsemen of the Anthropocene, which are fire, floods, heat, and drought, because those 4 and they often come in combination as well. So we don't just get one impact, we get multiple impacts, and that's really, really hard. And so we see this kind of zone of increasing unlivability that goes across the equator, but all the way up to southern Spain, south of Italy, and all the way down to the tip of the African continent, all of Asia, down all the way through Australia, and down in South America to sort of Patagonia. So if you look at that, what you see is these places which are home to, billions of people are going to become increasingly unlivable, and also coastlines, of course, river deltas, many of our most populous cities. But then you notice that sort of at higher latitudes, so in the south there isn't much land at higher latitudes, but in the north there is, things are more livable. I mean, nowhere's going to escape the negative impacts of climate change, but they are better able to adapt, and they'll also experience some positive impacts of climate change as well. So they are the more livable areas. And if you look at migration, because migration is a natural adaptation that most species use. We're already seeing a migration of those that can, like insects, birds, fish, even, static plants like trees. The tree line has noticeably migrated north, and humans too.
Let me just come back to the countries affected, because I think this is really fascinating. It's not just poor countries that are affected, are it? In your, we're talking about parts of the United States,
Yeah, well, look now, right, at 1.35 degrees, we've got more than 100 million Americans under extreme heat alerts. We've got floods across the US in the north. Pennsylvania has been, there's deaths. There's the capital of Vermont is marooned. It's in a state of emergency. Canada's been on fire for months. We're experiencing the health effects of Canadian wildfires, not just in New York and in America, but also in Europe. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. The East Coast is experiencing tornadoes. Well, Midwest is tornadoes. The East Coast is experiencing floods, typhoons, hurricanes that are much more extreme than they were before. We're going to see key, really important cities like New Orleans going to be unviable soon. And that migration too is going to happen in the States. We're already seeing some of that. So, it's not just poor countries. And I think that is perhaps the wake-up call of the last few years, maybe 2 to 3 years. We saw it first in Australia, a rich country, which is climatically really unfortunate in this instance. They had black summer fires, then they had terrible floods, then they had more fires. I mean, the clock is ticking. But instead of thinking of climate change as something that will happen in the future or just is going to affect, poor people in the global south, I think we're realizing it's affecting us now. I live in London. I had to pull my kids out of school last year because of the heat was too extreme in their classrooms. There, it's the biggest firefighter call out since the Blitz because of wildfires around London. I mean, Christ, it's everywhere now.
I mean, because if you're a policymaker or politician, you might just say, hold out your hands and say, look, everywhere's affected. It's going to be bad everywhere. And that's not quite what you're saying, is it? You're saying in the book, you're saying, look, we can already identify the places that are going to be really hit. And, Miami, which is like, in fashion, well, has been in fashion politically, but also with the tech pros and all these people who think of themselves as super far-sighted, it floods from below, doesn't it? I mean, there's no way you can build a wall around Miami and save it from flooding. There's no easy solution. And
no, exactly.
So you're saying that, look, there are some places we can already identify which are going to be really badly hit, and then some places like Canada's on fire, but it's going to be livable. Despite those.
Yeah, exactly. I think we do have the data to be able to identify. I mean, weather is one of those things that is chaotic and is hard to predict. But long term, when we look at the models, it is, and I would say as well. So we had all the keep 1.5 alive. Well, let's forget that. We're going to exceed that in the next few years. 1.5. Keep 2 degrees alive. Yes, because every degree matters. Every tenth of a degree matters, but even at 2 degrees, right, we're seeing the impacts right now in 2023 at we're officially 1.2 degrees above the pre-industrial average, but actually about 1.35. We're seeing impacts that weren't expected until the 2040s or 2050s. So the climate sensitivity to carbon dioxide seems to be much, much greater than we thought, the upper end of this. So, if we look at that and we actually, and we look at where is going to be most affected and where is going to be safer, that's what policymakers should be doing. That's what leaders should be doing. They should really be investing, because it's not just people that are going to move. It's also capital, it's money, properties, skills, expertise. All of these things are going to be migrating. It's the physics that we can't argue with. Now, we will be able to do something about some of these places. We can adapt to a certain degree for some of these things, but where are we going to adapt? We need to channel and focus on places that will be safer and better able to adapt. And they are places, for example, in Canada. In the United States, there are places like the Rust Belt cities that were abandoned. There's a lot of those around the Great Lakes are going to be much more adaptable. Everywhere's going to have to adapt anyway, but some places are going to be able to, the impacts will be less. If we're experiencing in Europe crazy temperatures, flooding, heat wave, just have a look at what they're experiencing in India and Pakistan and Vietnam or the Philippines. We don't hear so much about that, but it's much more extreme and it's affecting a lot more people. Already the media coverage of climate change has kicked up a pace over recent weeks, but it is almost entirely focused on wealthy countries, and that is what we experience in this sort of social unjust world. We have to realize that certain places are really becoming unlivable.
You mentioned in the book that you panic Googled Canada and New Zealand as possible places to buy some land for you and your kids. Was that serious? Or...
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, I really think if you're going to invest in something, if you're going to think about moving house or an education or moving to a workplace, one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is, what is the climate going to be like there? How viable is this in 10 years, right? I mean, unless you're 98, you're going to be, this is your life. It's not just your kids' life. This is your life as well, this climate chaos. Don't buy a house at the bottom of a hill in a flood zone,
Yeah. No, asking for a friend, but how do you think England is going to do on this? You say in the book that England of the 2020s is not the England of the 1950s, and it won't be England of the 2070s. I wonder, do you have a sense of well, there are going to be climate migrants within Britain, because I mean, if you look at the southeast, it's already it's entering a spell of continual chronic drought because of the precipitation changes.
If you look at the southwest, that's a lot of that is experiencing flood and coastal erosion, all of those sorts of things. And if you look at our adaptation, there was a report out actually only a day or two ago, which slammed the government's adaptation to heat and to climate generally. We are not doing the adaptation we need to do. And we are a wealthy country with relatively small climate impacts. You know, we need to change everything to adapt to this new climate. We're not doing it here. You know, and we're going to be hosting a lot of climate migrants as well. I mean, if you look further north, if you look at Scotland, Scotland's quite lucky, Ireland lucky. You know, in terms of climate impacts, they will be much reduced. They will even see some positive impacts. You know, it won't get as cold in the winter, so we won't have to pay as much on heating. Agricultural yields will be boosted. They won't, in Scotland, they won't have a problem with sea level rise, because Scotland's still rising from the last you know, from the retreat of the glaciers. You know, it's still bouncing back, and it's bouncing back higher than the sea level can keep up with it. And, you know, this is going to be the new north, this area around the Arctic and, you know, Iceland, Greenland, Scotland, Scandinavia, these shipping routes are going to be increasingly important. This is going to be much more of a, you know, financial centre and economic industrial center of the world over the coming decades. So, you know, that these are better places to be. Canada is definitely a better place to be. You know, Canada is already planning to you know, treble its population. It's put in place policies, and it's receiving lots of people from Afghanistan, Syria, but also you know, India and the Far East. That's a national project to increase its economy, and it's completely understandable. You know, a lot of countries did this and have been doing it until very, very recently. This kind of attitude to immigration is actually very recent. This negative, toxic attitude that you know, Britain and some of our European neighbours have adopted.
Well, let's come on to that. I just want to say, by the way, that it's exactly a year since it was 40 degrees or 42 degrees in the UK. And you mentioned, July 19th, and you mentioned adaptation, and I would be fascinated to hear from anyone in the audience about whether they've seen any evidence of adaptation to high temperatures in that period of, if it had happened.
I mean, that was those days. You know, the railways buckled, so you couldn't have any trains. The airports were closed. Hospitals couldn't cope. You know, I mean, we are not in any way ready for this, and I've seen very little, and that's what the report said in the last couple of years. We're not doing nearly enough.
Well, let's come on to sort of how migration is viewed and how it should be viewed, because that's like a big part of the book, and it's a fascinating part. And as you say, we've got all this, you know, not just in the UK, but in other countries, this sort of very negative attitude towards immigration. You mentioned in the book that you're a daughter and granddaughter of migrants. I think I remember that. Right? Has that personal history sort of shaped your perspective and coming to this?
I guess I've always, you know, felt the influence of various different nationalities, identities, languages. You know, I've never felt like one of those people that says, oh, I can trace my ancestry back to the Vikings or something. I've sort of always thought that was a bit odd. And
I think they own large parts of London, those people.
Yeah, I know. And they're probably French. They probably came over with the Normans anyway. I mean, the whole thing is just like, you know, what does it anyway? I guess the Normans were Vikings.
But you want us to, so look, you know, people talk in terms of Britain is full, we're struggling, we don't have enough houses, don't have enough doctors. And you're arguing,
well, that's absolutely true, that we don't have enough doctors and we don't have enough houses. But that is not, that is a policy choice that the government has made over the past decade or more, and more than that with housing, actually. And it's nothing to do with immigration at all. You know, we're not managing to provide the houses, the access to medical facilities, access to schools, or infrastructure, any of that for the existing population because of policies. Now, if immigration is to work, it needs to be supported financially. So it means that governments need to plan for an expanded population. So they need to make sure that the finances are available to increase access to these, which they're not providing for the existing population. Otherwise, of course, there will be conflict. And there also needs to be, social investment, not just financial investment, in making sure that inclusion is really at the heart of all of this. And, an expanded idea of what it means to be part of that nation, what it means to be a citizen of a country. So that incoming people feel like citizens, they feel like Londoners, and Londoners think of them as Londoners, and everybody is kind of aligned in providing a London that has a future. I mean, I'm talking about London because that's where I am, but that's equally true for Manchester or Bristol or Berlin or wherever, right? So that investment needs to be made. But in terms of immigration, it is, I think that we are experiencing at the moment this very toxic narrative driven by a very far right kind of mindset, populist leaders quite often who, it's the easiest trope in the world to scapegoat immigrants and to use them as the divisive kind of blameworthy community for all your failed policies as a government. But Britons see through that. I think we've seen surveys which show that Britons are actually not xenophobic on the whole. More than half think, for example, refugees make a positive contribution to society. 2/3 think that refugees should be allowed, asylum seekers should be allowed to work while they're waiting for their applications, and that is an attitude which exists despite a really strong media and governmental line, basically saying the opposite, basically trying to sow seeds of distrust and hate against immigrants. So I think there's a really strong seed that people don't, they don't swallow this crap. And we are all mixed, we're not just mixed, because we're all humans and, tens of thousands of years ago. We're mixed really recently. In recent generations, we've all moved around. And my immigrants make such an enormous contribution to our economies, to our societies, our cultures. There are a lot of things spouted that are not true about immigrants, that they increase unemployment, that they lower wages, that they increase crime. Actually, the opposite is true in all of that. And we have so much data to show that, because the economy is not a zero-sum game. There aren't X number of jobs, and if immigrants come in, they take those jobs, and so there's not enough for the existing sort of native population or something. It doesn't work like that, the economy. The economy expands as people add to it, because immigrants also need dentists, or they need to buy a coffee, or they need their clothes fixed, and they're also doing jobs. People move for work. Almost entirely, they move for work, and they move to where the work is.
You have this nice example in the book of Czech workers who were allowed over the border into Germany, I think it was, to work, but they would go home to live, and they did have a negative impact on employment with no corresponding benefits in terms of economic growth, because you say the problem was they weren't migrants. They were going back home every night and spending their money there, and had they been allowed to move there and spend their wages, then they would have had that
exactly
benefit.
Yeah, so Germany's had a very kind of backward kind of attitude to immigration for a long time, and that's changing, and it's changed recently. But yeah, either people come in and they are part of the society, they contribute to the economy. These are normally young people, right? Working age people moving, who pay taxes, who are kind of members of the economy as well as society and culture, and they're producing children that then, help. We've got this demographic deficit, this huge crisis growing in most countries in the West, and not just the West, China as well, I guess. So where people are not having enough babies to support an aging population, and this is, it's the proverbial has already hit the fan in Japan, right? Where they have an aging, really, people in Japan live a long time because they eat delicious sushi and things, I suppose. But, they need care workers, and Japan is very, very xenophobic, doesn't want immigrants to come in. It makes it very, very hard to have let people become citizens. And so, they've gone down the whole attempts of getting robots and AI to be these citizens, and they've even given them some form of citizenship. Incredible. It's kind of easier to become a citizen in Japan if you're a robot than if you're an actual person. But they've had to admit failure, right? It doesn't work. There are some jobs that AI do really well, but a lot of jobs, they just do not do very well. And these are actually the jobs that we need with an aging population as well. So they've actually had to weaken their immigration. I mean, we have, because of our self-imposed border restrictions with Brexit and, our fabulous Home Secretary's kind of rules on everything, we have now labour shortages everywhere, from farm work to hospitality to construction, across the board. Economists are crying out and business leaders are crying out for more people to be allowed to come in. It doesn't make economic sense.
And you give a historic example of these Nansen passports that the UN sort of supervised, which was for stateless peoples to give them, I think, a temporary opportunity to go and look for work in particular countries, and that's a potential model for the future, as you see it. Maybe not the sort of the right to seek asylum as a climate refugee, but a sort of temporary right to go and seek work in a more climatically stable country.
Yeah, I think. I really think that we need to just change the whole narrative around borders, migration, all of this, and really look at it from an economic perspective, largely. So at the moment, migration is treated largely as a security issue. It's dealt with by Home Secretaries, by military, border enforcement, all of that. It's actually an economic issue. It's a labour issue, and it should be treated. It's also a humanitarian issue, of course. And I think there is huge value to sorting this out so that it becomes managed. And that means not waiting till people are asylum seekers, suffering horrific tragedies. I don't know, 33 million people were displaced in about a week in Pakistan last year because of floods, right? That's where we are now. In 10 years, in 20 years, this is going to be regional. People they're not going to be able to move within their countries. They're going to have to cross borders. They're going to have to move away from entire kind of areas. It's much better not to deal with these as kind of catastrophic evacuations with loads of refugees and asylum seekers. And how do we manage that? It's much better, I think, to plan that right now in a piecemeal way and look at, when do people generally move? There is a time across the world, culturally, going back a long time, when people move, and that's kind of, late teens to late 20s, early 30s. That's when people move naturally. They're leaving the family home, they're moving for education, for jobs, for adventure, for love. They're forming their own families, all of that. That's the time to encourage these young people full of potential, who can make amazing, productive members of your society, to help them move to a safer place, to offer them opportunities in safer places, and to plan for it, to make sure that you do plan. The world's population is 8 billion at the moment. It's going to go up. So we need to plan for more people anyway. But those places which are going to see the larger numbers of people coming, we can plan for that. They can become established citizens, produce, the societies of the next 10, 20, 30 years. And then those networks form, and that diaspora can then help people who move, the older people or more vulnerable people can move and be helped by people who are already there, existing members of their community and society, because people move in networks. Then it isn't a huge burden on the state. It isn't a huge burden really for anywhere. This is a tragic situation. We need to make it as easy. We need to facilitate it. We need to plan for it, and we need to make it as, financially viable as we can. And that might be by a UN organization. I think we need to help facilitate this, help move people to, there's no kind of international databases of jobs that are available, of educational positions that are available, of grants that are available, to help manage this. Yeah. And Nansen style passports might be that. The borders that we have at the moment are not appropriate. They are absolutely not viable for a world of 2 degrees, let alone 3 or 4 degrees. They really are not. They were made in a different era, normally most of them quite recently, and most of them were actually created to keep people in, right? Not to stop and to stop people leaving, and to bring more people in for labour, to join the military, to join the the work in the fields or build industry, just as we did with the Windrush generation or £10 POMs or whatever. So it's simply, we need to rethink. We need to rethink all of this.
And it would, you talk in the book about the sort of green cities we can build, because obviously this climate migration is an adaptation, but we also have to go about that adaptation in a way that minimizes emissions. And you talk about sort of building cities, densely populated places which are more efficient, lower emissions per person, but building them in a way that I guess aren't like the cities we have now. And I've actually got there was a question here about whether there's any sign that town planners realize that high-rise glass-faced tower blocks will be uninhabitable fairly soon without air conditioning that is unsustainably power hungry. I'm not sure whether the glass-faced tower blocks are that unsustainable or that bad, and they certainly have problems. But you talk about wood as a building material, about reflective surfaces, etc. What are the cities? What's the vision?
Yeah, well, I mean, the truth is that everywhere is going to have to, this is a huge upheaval. Everywhere is going to have to adapt, right? Whether you're living in Mumbai or whether you're living in London, wherever, you're going to have to adapt because everything has changed. So that does mean different building materials. We've got to move away from concrete, which at the moment is a huge contributor to carbon emissions. We've got to redesign the way we plan our streets. And at the moment we have these, our streets are built and our infrastructure, everything is built for a different climate. We've moved away from that kind of temperate climate that, Brits talk about the weather all the time. We're famous for talking about the weather. And yet we have noticeably one of the most boring weathers on earth. It's just kind of drizzle. Slightly warmer drizzle in the summer, colder drizzle in the winter. Like, we don't have these dramatic extremes, but that's gone now. Now we really are having dramatic extremes. We're having, there's new words in our vocabulary, things like atmospheric rivers, weather and heat domes and, various types of
rivers is in my vocabulary, but then
well, it means that these extremes where the hot air is holding so much water that we get these floods that last, instead of, an hour or so, they last for days or weeks. And our streets can't cope. We don't have the drainage for that. And the same with drought. The drought is so severe in some places that the soil and the ground is compacting and making infrastructure like bridges and foundations of buildings unstable. It's a real problem that we're coming to, and our buildings are just not coping. They're not built for this. We are going to have to adapt to a hotter climate. We're going to have buildings that don't just sort of suck out energy from the grid, but actually produce their own energy. We're going to, obviously we have to have this huge energy transition, but, these can be better cities, much better cities. They're going to be denser because we need more people. But instead of having these alienating tall tower blocks where nobody knows anyone, there's no sense of community, and there's, they're ridden with crime and there's lack of opportunity and destitution, essentially. We need to build livable cities, something like 4 to 6 stories with community spaces that aren't sort of completely commercialized and owned by private enterprise, but are places where people can come together and form those communities that are going to be key for resilience as we enter these really difficult times ahead. We're going to have an energy transition, of course, that's already underway, but that again could be really great. Once we have a huge rollout, which needs to be much faster, but once we have it, of wind and solar and heat pumps and geothermal, these don't need to be refueled all the time like coal and gas and oil. They're essentially there, free, giving you cheap, abundant energy. And that makes everything else so much easier.
I mean, what I hear from you is really this quote that you use in the book from Angela Merkel, which is, at the time when she took in what turned out to be, I think, 1 million refugees from Syria, she said, we will manage, right? And I get that sense from the book that, it can be apocalyptic if you spend too much time looking at wildfires or, heat maps, etc. But I mean, you seem to have a real faith in humanity and this, and also this sort of long view that humanity has always migrated and it will continue to migrate. It's not the end.
Absolutely. I mean, this is doable. We still have lots and lots of choices. I want people to start talking about all of these things, talking about climate migration, talking about, how people can move, the numbers we're talking about, how we make it work for all of us, because we are endlessly inventive. We can come up with solutions to pretty much everything that we've come across. But at the moment, we're being held back because there isn't honesty. There really is not honesty from our leaders about the reality of what we face in the coming decades. And there isn't honesty about what our choices are. We are fed this kind of like children, we're fed these kind of stories of, oh no, it's going to be fine. We're going to be we're the greenest country and whatever, reach net zero before everyone else, and we're also going to open new gas and oil and even a coal powered station, and we're going to start fracking. What the hell? Let's have some clarity on actually what it means. And when we, if we can't afford the green transition, what does that actually mean, right? Because let's look at the costs of the green transition, the short-term costs, and let's look at the costs of not doing the green transition at this time. We're going to have to do it anyway, all right? There isn't a choice now. We're going to have to do it anyway. Should we do it now with higher upfront costs, but much, much lower overall costs? Or should we wait and make everything a hell of a lot worse? These are the choices that we genuinely have, and we're not being told honestly what they involve. So people are, they're unable to follow, and they don't have trust in leaders to deliver any of this. Who would?
I want to ask one final question before I come to the audience questions, of which there are many good ones already, but still time to type one in, which is Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, I've been to briefings by economists and even by government people saying, look, this is the future economic growth driver of the world. You've got a population that's going from 1 billion to 2 billion to 3 billion by the end of the century. If we take your projection, and it always struck me that those projections were done without thinking about climate change, right? They
exactly.
I mean,
it's amazing.
What are you saying about Nigeria or about?
So
are they never going to reach that size because people are going to leave, as it were?
So there are a few places where population is still growing. Okay, so globally, population is likely to peak in the 2060s, and then it may even come down to where we are today by the end of the century. The two huge drivers of that are urbanization. When people move to cities, as they are doing rapidly, people have fewer children. And when women and girls are educated and given rights, again, fewer children. So we are getting to that stage. And yes, they are going to be economic drivers, but not on that continent. right? They are going to bring their skills, their vibrancy, their intelligence, their their drive. They're going to bring that. That's what I mean by it's not just the people moving, it's also the capital. That cultural knowledge and expertise, all of that is going to be moving further north. When the world becomes less inhabitable in these areas, it doesn't mean everybody will leave, but it means that large populations will not be viable in the way that they are today. So, we already have places that are, they're basically unlivable for much of the year. Places like Dubai and Qatar and Phoenix in Arizona, they are only livable because of enormous amounts of adaptation. Everything in Dubai is brought in: food, water. They live in an artificial air-conditioned shopping mall. And so a small wealthy population can live like that in Dubai. Yeah. That works. But 30 to 50 million people in Mumbai, 2040, 2060, no, right? A small population will live like that.
You need people to work on the streets and to do building work.
Exactly. And those people are all dying, right? Not all of them, but a lot of them. We've had in Qatar, they are generally climate migrants, right? From Nepal, from Pakistan, right? Who have had to leave to seek their fortunes as construction workers in these places. And they're dying of, kidney failure, heat stroke. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible way to die because it is unlivable. A lot of these places, they only do work anyway at nighttime with head torches, which is, bad anyway for your health. Sort of working entirely in night shift, a nocturnal existence. But even then, it's still deadly, for large numbers of people. This is not going to be the solution. So we're going to have to find alternatives. And, if you don't like this, if you don't like the idea of so many climate migrants, then, what's the alternative? There are, we can reduce the numbers by investing massively in mitigation, emissions reductions. We can invest massively in adaptation for a lot of these places that are the hardest hit. We're saying we're not doing it in Britain yet. Well, they're not doing it in Nigeria, in Lagos, right? This is not adapted for the conditions to come.
We have a question on that point, actually, from Kevin. Do we simply accept that parts of the world are uninhabitable, will become uninhabitable, or look at ways of continuing to sustain these economies with financial support? I mean, part of what you're saying there is that you could promote some adaptation even in this
absolutely, they need adaptation, but so you need a combination, and this will exist. This will be this will be an issue everywhere, in Britain, in America, in Bangladesh. Some places you invest in heavily adapted scenarios. You really, really adapt it to that to the conditions, whether it's extreme temperature, whether it's extreme flooding, all of those things. And some places you have to say, no, we're going to retreat from there. We're going to sacrifice that area. It's not worth it. And that's already happening in small villages, coastal villages in England. It's going to happen much, much more widely across the global south very soon. The problem is moving is very hard at the moment. We make it very hard. It's hard anyway. People don't want to move. They don't want to leave their country, their community, their friendship groups, their jobs and their language, all of that, to move to another country that's safer, or even a place that's safer in their own country. They want to move there because they don't know people, they face prejudice. We make it very, very hard for them, all of those things. And so many people are needlessly dying because of that very issue. And that's, we need to make things easier from that perspective. But, there are things we haven't even talked about in terms of choices, and which, again, we need to have, national, but also international, honest discussions about. And they are things like geoengineering. Are we going to reduce the temperature of the planet artificially while we sort some of these things out? Because, that again is that there are no easy options, right? There are no easy options. Everything has trade-offs. The easy options, we had them in the 1980s. We do not have them anymore. Everything's got trade-offs, but we need to be honest about that. we need to decide, are we going to look into this research? Are we going to deploy it? If so, where? Who will get to deploy it? How will we decide it?
Very briefly, because I want to come to more questions if I can, but should we open the door to geoengineering?
I think we definitely need to talk about it. I think it's going to happen anyway in the next 10, 20 years, but I would much rather it came with regulations, that there was compensatory procedures in place for negative effects of it, that we had parameters around its use and agreed criteria for how to use it, all of those things, rather than a country unilaterally decides they can't take it anymore, we're going to deploy this in the hope that we get livable conditions for longer, fewer people have to flee, a big nation like India or China. I think we need to talk about this sooner. It's not governments enacted emergency legislation to bring in lockdowns because we had a global pandemic. It was a public health emergency and they needed to save lives. It was an acute emergency. Those lockdowns lasted, well, some places months, but generally weeks at a time. If we do the same thing, there were no discussions before that of, under what circumstances will we have lockdowns, nothing like that, that it was democratically decided, nothing. And I'm fine with that, right? It saved lives, few. It could be done better. A lot of this could have been done better, as the pandemic inquiry is finding out. But if we were talking about geoengineering, this is not going to be for a few weeks or maybe a few months. This would be a long-term solution or action that would affect the globe, right? We need to have those discussions, honestly.
Let's park that there. Very quickly, one word answer. Why haven't you mentioned Russia and Siberia or northern China as places with a viable future? Just very briefly, are they places that will be...
Yeah, absolutely. Russia actually stands to gain a lot from this. I mean, Putin's in his 70s, I don't know how long he's going to last. Maybe several years, maybe he'll accidentally fall out of a window in the next few weeks. Who knows? And who knows who's coming after him? But, we can't be trapped in today's kind of political situation. We have to look longer term at what we're facing. And, Siberia, a lot of Siberia is going to rapidly change. Permafrost is completely changing. Some of that will be drained, will be agricultural land. That whole coastline, we don't know what it will be viable for. Everything from large scale fisheries to mining to exploitation, as in bad ways as well as good ways. But certainly a lot of these horrible Soviet era towns, the sort of Stalin towns, will be much more viable as temperatures warm.
To move there, you've got to have a tip. Is the current UK government, this is from Anonymous, planning... I
imagine the food's bad.
Right.
But again, that's what immigration solves very quickly.
Good. There'll be better vegan options in Siberia. Is the current UK government planning for this shift in the future? Does it have a specific position on climate migration? And I want to combine that with a question.
No, it doesn't. And this is a huge problem. The government is not...
No, it's got no real...
Well, its policy on migration, I think we've all seen it, is basically comes down to stop the boats. I think it's as long and short of that, and it's not very well thought out at all. And
people flee unsustainable conditions in central sub-Saharan Africa, and we send them back to Rwanda. That probably isn't a
exactly.
Policy,
I mean, the whole thing's a complete car crash. But I mean, we need to look again. We need to look beyond this government, which is not going to be in power for more than another year.
Do you and a question from Yvonne, do you speak to MPs? Do they listen to you? Are they being educated?
I have spoken to a couple. There is huge reticence to even broach this subject, and that is through all of this, the way that migration is being discussed and handled, and the way that climate change is being discussed and handled, but particularly migration, there has been this huge abdication of responsibility on left and centrist government, who have this timidity to even approach it and to discuss it because they're afraid of a xenophobic minority. And what we need is a new narrative. We need leadership with vision, who can honestly talk about the reality of what we face and how we manage it. Because, if you don't like this idea of trying to adapt and mitigate climate change and trying to help people with one form of adaptation, which is moving away from dangerous, unlivable conditions to more livable conditions, if you don't like that, then what's your alternative? Because what I see is my primary school age children conscripted into armies to fight fleeing Bangladeshis, or, fleeing engineering students from Lagos. And that's not a future that I want to see. We can do a lot better than this if we manage it. It's going to be difficult, there are no easy choices, it's going to be difficult, but we can do it in a way that builds a better world, that builds a more productive cities and societies, all the while restoring the planet's climate, ecology. We've also got a biodiversity crisis, so that, we restore livability. It's not ideal that we're living in a world where large portions of the world are becoming unlivable for people. It's really not ideal. We can do better than that.
Jack asks on that point, do you think there will be a version of stranded assets when it comes to land? So we've heard about oil and gas assets.
And that's actually a real problem. And that's where a lot of people will be trapped. So that's kind of what I was saying when I was saying, if you do make an investment, if you do think about where you're going to move to, do put climate right at the center of that. And also for your pension, for other investments, don't invest in a bad financial mess, a poor investment of fossil fuels. That's a dying industry, wrapped up in climate litigation that's just coming. Invest in future green, socially responsible technologies or biotech or whatever, to build a better world. But what we're going to see at the moment, so in this country, a lot of houses are being built in places that they shouldn't be. And their houses are being built that immediately need to be retrofitted.
Yeah.
What the hell? I mean, it's just ridiculous, because building codes were so weakened in 2016. In the US, they're still being built because of political lobbying, they're still being built in fire risk zones, in flood risk zones, all of that. And these houses will not be, what happens is they become uninsurable, because the insurance industry is one of the first movers in all of this. That's why the fossil fuel industry is about to have a massive crash, because of insurance costs. It's not a viable investment. But the same thing with housing. If you have a business or a residency in a area that is very likely to be flood hit or whatever, you won't be able to get insurance for that, and then you won't be able to sell it, because who's going to buy something you can't insure? And so what's happening is some governments are coming in and underwriting it in certain areas. They did that in New Orleans. They've done it at least twice in New Orleans. That's not sustainable. So at what stage do they decide, that's not going to happen? And then rich people can move away, right? So you get this kind of climate apartheid, you get this climate gentrification, I guess. People move away from risky areas that can afford to, and the poor get stuck. They cannot move. They can't afford to move because where they live is completely worthless because of climate change. And the thing is, as people move away from these towns, businesses move away, they become less and less viable in terms of, nobody wants to live there because there isn't a grocery store that's open. There's no businesses to work in. It becomes a deprived area socially and economically, as well as because of the flooding. So all of these things are connected. And we absolutely need to talk about that. And how are we going to help poorer people move? Because the people that are most impacted in rich countries as well as poor countries are marginalized groups. they are the ones that are stuck without air conditioning in heat waves. They're the ones that are living in flooded basements that drown in their own homes. All of these things are connected, and we need a fair way of planning our viable cities for the future that make it livable for everybody.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful tour of all the policy changes that we could think about, and people will have heard your message. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. I do want to end on one note. Sometimes I go to these events on climate, and there's such desire to do something, and your book rightly emphasizes that policy is where it's at, that it's that's solving these problems collectively is key. But I wonder if people are going away with such motivation about what they can do for the climate, and they want to do something individually just to kickstart things. Any suggestions? So there's lots of things you can do.
First of all, put pressure on your political leaders, right? So write letters to your members of parliament, campaign and vote for a government that actually gives a shit about these issues and has a strategy to do something about it. If you do have investments, invest wisely. Don't invest in industries that are making it worse. Make your own environment much more friendly to nature and climate resilient. So don't have artificial grass, don't have massive paved driveways. There are options that allow water to soak through, pollinators that are rich, all of those things. And eat much less meat and dairy, eat mainly plants. You don't have to become 100% vegan. And if you want more information on how to go about that, read Henry's brilliant book. You absolutely should. But really, you don't have to be vegan, but you do have to eat a lot less meat, and it's not a deprivation. Believe me, it's good for your health. It's good for the planet. It's good for your soul.
Excellent. Well, it's almost time for me to go and cook a Beyond Burger for dinner. So right on key. Thank you all so much for watching. We had a really great audience today, and thanks for the great questions. And if we couldn't get to them, the answers to many of them are in Gaia's book, Nomad Century. So please go out and buy it. And it's 200 of the best and most succinct pages you'll read.
Thank you, Henry.
Gaia, Henry, thank you so much. That was so fascinating and far-reaching and sobering too, but it was amazing to get such a clear and hopeful look into the future. So thank you very much for that conversation. And thank you again to our audience for all of your questions, and to Keystone Positive Change for making tonight possible. We're going to take a break over the summer, so please do tune in for the rest of our Keystone series when we begin again in September. But we do have one last event before our August break. Next week, Con Tabine will be in conversation with the poet Sean Hewitt, discussing his new essay collection, A Guest at the Feast. You can find information about how to register for that on our website, 5by15.com. Thank you again all for attending this evening, and good night.